Good afternoon. My name is Timothy Hampton. I am the director of the Doreen B. Townsend Center for the Humanities at the University of California at Berkeley. I'm happy to welcome you to today's event, which is the first installment in this year's program of Berkeley Book Chats, in which a Berkeley faculty member discusses a recently published book. Today's guest is Professor Christopher Tomlins of the Law School, discussing his new book, In the Matter of Nat Turner, A Speculative History. He will be joined by Professor Bryan Wagner of the Department of English. Before I turn things over to our guests, let me remind you of a couple of upcoming events sponsored by the Townsend Center. Tomorrow, Thursday at 4 p.m., we will be hosting the distinguished novelist and essayist Joyce Carol Oates, discussing her work with our colleague John Choctaw of the English Department. And on October 14th and 15th at 4 p.m., we will be welcoming this year's UNA's lecturer, who is Professor Jeannie Suk Gerson of the Harvard Law School. Her presentation will be titled Ordinary Trauma. Our next book chat will be on October 21st, when Professor Victoria Kahn of the Department of Comparative Literature will be discussing her new book, The Trouble with Literature. Please feel free to check the Townsend Center website for information about all of our upcoming events. So I'm happy now to turn the discussion over to Christopher Tomlins and Bryan Wagner. They'll chat about the new book, and toward the end of the hour, we'll open the forum up to questions. So if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A function of Zoom to ask them. So it's my pleasure now to turn it over to Bryan and Chris.
Thanks so much, Tim. I'm Bryan Wagner, and I want to say first thanks to the Townsend Center for organizing this event and for their ongoing work with the excellent book chat series. I also want to say what an honor it is to participate in this event. I've learned so much from Chris's work over the years, and I'm excited to talk today about this wonderful new book. So as Tim mentioned, we'll talk for a bit, and then we will open for questions through the Q&A function in Zoom. I will read your questions to Chris at that point. But so, Chris, to start though, first I wanted to ask you about the book's subject and method. It feels in some ways like a departure from your previous work, so thinking in particular about your last book, Freedom Bound, which is covers a lot of ground, 1580 to 1865, really making slavery and colonization central to what becomes the United States, working in the mode, I think we could say, of legal and intellectual history. This book feels different in some ways. And so I was just wondering if to start, you could say something about, how you came to write about Nat Turner, but also how you came to feel that the book should take the form of a speculative history, which is the term you use.
Right, well, Freedom Bound, as you have pointed out, was a large undertaking. And it was an undertaking that I wanted to break away from. In a sense, I couldn't really imagine myself trying to do the same thing over again on the scale of that book. And so in casting around for something to occupy me, something that I wanted to write about, something that I was curious about, I came to the subject of Nat Turner through a curiosity that I had kept in the back of my head for 30 odd years. Ever since first reading Thomas Ruffin Gray's pamphlet, The Confessions of Nat Turner, which features prominently in this book. Also reading work by William Styron, particularly, actually the first thing I read of Styron's was his Darkness Visible, his autobiographical description of depression and institutionalization. And that led me on to then read his Confessions of Nat Turner. But this was all many, many years ago. I had never any particular plan myself to write about Turner. I did, in a very indirect sense, write one essay that touched very remotely upon the Turner Rebellion. But in deciding to engage with Turner, to return to this sort of itch that I wanted to scratch, what really made the connection that aroused not just my curiosity, but my desire to write, was that in the intervening period, that is over the last 15 years, I've become increasingly interested in and written somewhat in the manner of Walter Benjamin. And, to anybody who is sympathetic with Benjamin's worldview or interested in Benjamin's own intellectual history, the sort of the combination that Turner presents us with of an extraordinary messianic religiosity and an involvement in one of the most violent social events of antebellum Virginia, well, antebellum America, it's kind of intoxicating. Religion and violence as a subject matter. So that's what took me to it. The other thing that took me to it, again in reaction, as in a way, from having spent 15, 20 years researching that large, sprawling study of of American colonization, I thought, naively, as it turned out, that I wanted to have something precise, something microcosmic to engage with. A person, to the extent that one can write about Turner as a person, and an event, a discrete event. And that kind of went out the window very, very early on, because in engaging with Turner, you find yourself engaging, obviously, with religion. You find yourself engaging with a particularly a particular form of faith. And I say in the book, I ended up finding myself writing about God. So far from exchanging a macrocosm for a microcosm, I find myself actually exchanging a macrocosm for cosmology, in a sense itself.
Yeah, great. Maybe could we talk a little bit more about that Thomas Gray pamphlet, Confessions of Nat Turner from 1831? You really do make a case for it being necessarily central to our understanding of Nat Turner. As you know, some other scholars have cautioned against using it, Scott French and others. And so I was wondering if you could, for people who maybe don't know the document, if you could maybe just describe a little bit about its structure and content, but also how you address it in the book, and why you think it needs to be central in spite of its potential corruption or unreliability.
I think in many ways it's one of the most, it's an extraordinary document in American history. It's the product of in a sense, an extraordinary situation, an extraordinary encounter between two individuals. One of the things that one finds interesting about it, well, one of the things that I find interesting about it is that if you actually look at Thomas Ruffin Gray, the person, he's an incredibly ordinary person. He's not a particularly interesting person, and he never really does anything else that's interesting. Even other writing of his is, by comparison with Confessions of Nat Turner, the pamphlet, is just utterly ordinary. So, in a sense, the extraordinariness of the situation draws something creative, constructive out of him as a writer. The pamphlet itself is constructed by Thomas Ruffin Gray. He is a 30-year-old Virginia attorney from the locality within which the rebellion took place, Southampton County, Virginia, specifically the town of Jerusalem, which is now known as Cortland. The Turner Rebellion occurs in August, late August of 1831. It is over comparatively quickly, over a period of 36 hours. And all of the participants are either dead or captured at the end of that time, except Nat Turner himself, who absents himself from the immediate locality, but returns to it very quickly, and then spends the next 2 months in the locality before being himself captured. The pamphlet itself arises from a series of conversations that Gray manages to arrange with Turner in jail while he is awaiting his trial. They take place over a period of 3 days. And what's interesting about, what's really important about the pamphlet is, and what I try to do with it in the book is to assess, as far as possible, the extent to which it can be used as as evidence, a source for engaging with the persona of Nat Turner. Because it's really the persona of Nat Turner that is the main, if you like, the main subject of the book. The book actually has several subjects, but that's the central spine of the book, in my view. Gray himself spends a lot of time on the scene of the rebellion. As a local attorney, he is involved as a court-appointed court-appointed attorney for several of the detained defendants. So he has a professional involvement in the event itself and its aftermath. He also has clearly, it seems to me, a desire to engage with a sort of a construction of an explanation of this event, his own construction. He pretty clearly writes reports for local newspapers anonymously, describing the events that have taken place. So he's engaged in his own, as it were, his own research on the events of the rebellion. And when he comes to construct the pamphlet, it basically has kind of two different, it is a complex document. It has several components. The two central, the components of the pamphlet that are labeled the confession, actually one can analyze as two relatively distinct components, one of which is much more fully prepared than the other. The fully prepared, or the more fully prepared part of the pamphlet is the part that Gray is really interested in, which is getting the sequence of the action of the rebellion itself right. Who gets killed when and where? And that is a smoothly written, smoothly punctuated, one thing after another account of what has occurred. Prior to that, however, there is a more clumsily written, a more roughly written part that is almost the same length as the account of the rebellion itself, which is an account of Turner's life prior to the moment of the rebellion. Now, that whole confession is presented as the narrative of a speaking first person, and I speaks this throughout. The narrative, in turn, is framed by a whole series of kind of controlling devices and authentications, which build this sort of cage of both control and authenticity around the narrative. I take a literary structuralist approach to the analysis of this text. And the argument that I present in the book is that by doing so, by breaking it into its elements and by analyzing the different elements, one can in fact make a relatively strong argument that the element of the text which addresses Turner's life prior to the rebellion itself is is composed from material that Gray encounters in the moment of the conversation, and therefore stands as something that one can reasonably treat as Turner's voice. That's important because if one is engaging with Nat Turner, if one is attempting to engage with this intellect, this is basically all the material there is to use. So to this extent, I said that the book, in my view, is primarily about Turner the person. This is not a social history of the rebellion. This is my attempt to encounter Nat Turner, the intellect. It is to write an intellectual history basically from fragments. And the way that I choose to write the intellectual history from the fragments is by taking the fragments very seriously, by reading them with as much intensity as I can, and by interleaving them with other texts that I believe can help us understand those fragments.
Mm.
So that's the method.
Mm-hmm.
Then the whole thing, you asked originally about sort of the nature of the book. The whole thing is also encased in my own other preoccupation, which is that I am using this as a way of reflecting myself on how it is that one writes history. For what purposes, to what ends, what is the philosophical purpose of and process of engaging in the writing of history? So that's the, in a nutshell, a very large nutshell. In a nutshell, that's the kind of the book. There are other elements of the book that I can talk about too, but that's sort of, those are, I think, its central themes.
Yeah. Yeah. So on your point about the kind of intellectual history of Nat Turner, you're really interested in him as an interpreter of the Bible, right? You know, and in particular too, an interpreter of the New Testament, right? Which is interesting because often we think about slave rebellion and slave resistance in the United States at that time in connection with the Old Testament, with the Exodus story, you know, David Walker, Denmark VC, these kinds of connections. For you, there's real emphasis brought to the New Testament, to the book of Revelation for some clear reasons, but also in particular to the Gospel of St. Luke, which I think is a really kind of strikingly original and beautifully developed aspect of your argument. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Luke, you know, in relationship to Turner's developing intellect.
Right. I often when one encounters someone who is, you know, to all intents and purposes, religious, right? One can think, well, here is a person who sprinkles into their discourse this kind of biblical allusion, or this kind of biblical sounding phraseology. And I think to a large extent, historians who have read the Confessions have always wanted to get through the first part to get to the second part. That is, you go through the stuff where Turner talks about his childhood, his dawning spirituality, his series of visions, and like, let's get to the action. Let's get to the rebellion. I wanted to take the first part very, very seriously. I didn't realize, as I was taking it seriously, that it would have, as, in my view, as coherent a theological structure as it seems to me it does have. That is, I mean, the Bible is a collage. We know this. You know, it refers back and forth to itself. Different bits of phraseology occur in this part, in that part, in the Old Testament, in the New Testament. So to argue that one can pull out of these 2,200 words a coherent theology may, for some people, be a stretch. Nevertheless, I'm trying to show that there is a coherent track to the way Turner is thinking about himself, is presenting himself, and is describing a coherent sequence of experiences that conform to a story that one finds most fully in Luke, in the Gospel of Luke. So Luke and Revelation, to me, carry much of the burden of Turner's own self-understanding as a thinking Christian. And as a sophisticated thinking Christian. Things that people have dismissed as simply kind of vague visions or uncanny illusions take on a certain fixity once they are associated with and located within the story of Christ's life and passion that Luke tells. Now, in the book, I asked myself, why Luke? Luke is considered, theologically, Luke is considered conservative. Luke is kind of preoccupied with hierarchies. There is of the Gospels, Luke is one of the clearest in assigning Christ a subordinate role to God, in creating different kinds of forms of servitude and subordination within the forms of theology that he is describing. I don't have a particularly good answer for why Turner finds Luke so fascinating. If indeed I am right that he does find Luke fascinating. I've been, it's early in the book's life to be getting kind of informed commentary on the arguments. To the extent that there has been some informed commentary from people in religious studies, there is skepticism, I would say, about this claim. Or rather, there is skepticism about one point that I make that may or may not have had some impact on the relationship between Turner and Luke, which is simply that Southampton County is divided into two parishes. One is Nottoway Parish, the other is St. Luke's Parish. Turner lives his entire life in St. Luke's Parish. It's an Episcopalian parish. It dates, of course, from the time when there was an established Anglican church in Virginia before its disestablishment. On the other hand, in Virginia, the vestries, even after disestablishment of the Anglican Church, still have an important political and administrative role in the running of localities. So it's not crazy to say that if somebody knows that they're living kind of in a town called Jerusalem, they may also be very well aware that they're living in a parish called St. Luke's Parish, and find that interesting, find that curious, and use that as a point of engagement between what they are deeply focused on, which is the Bible and their own life. So.
Great. Let me, so there's so much that's compelling about this book's understanding of the importance of religion to Nat Turner. And I think it's exactly right to say that there are these things that the kind of more mystical aspects of that part of Gray's pamphlet by others that have been kind of dismissed by others, as an attempt, on Gray's part, right, to turn him into a kind of enthusiastic lunatic, right, or something that actually there are these kind of secular grounds for the rebellion. And I think recovering and taking seriously Turner's theology is a really important contribution that doesn't stand or fall on the question of St. Luke's parish. I wanted to turn our attention though to, the book is also about other things, right? If it's about religion, it's also about law and economy.
Yes.
Later on in the book, you're thinking about the impact of the rebellion on Virginia's politics. You're looking at deliberations in the House of Delegates. In a kind of an aside, you use the term slaveholder legality. I think there's definitely a way in which this book is also a study of slaveholder legality. So I wonder if you could maybe discuss a bit those later aspects of the book.
Sure. Substantively, the book has these 3 points of concentration. That is religion, law, and economy, or more precisely, political economy. We've talked a little bit about the sort of the strand that one could call religion. The strand that one can loosely call law is really that strand that arises in 2 distinct ways. First of all, to go back to Gray's pamphlet just for a moment, Gray's pamphlet kind of masquerades as a legal document. And doesn't just masquerade as a legal document, it also conforms as a document to certain legal requirements for evidence in proceedings involving the prosecution of slaves. When one comes to the event of the rebellion, and this actually goes to the question, how do you represent a rebellion? I decided that the rebellion is a material event. It is a material event in the sense that it is a graphically violent assault. It is like an instant, one might, I liken it to a sort of the eruption of communal violence in a sense, in a sort of an anthropological sense. It is a graphically violent assault of one group of people within a community upon another part of the community. That is a group of slaves systematically killing destroying 15 white households. So that is like a material event. It is almost intentionally in my description of it, I am reducing, or I am presenting that event as a blunt instrument hitting a piece of meat. But that takes place within a legal context, which, as you say, I talk of as a slaveholder legality, which is in its turn has been and continues to be a blunt instrument hitting a piece of meat. That is what slaveholder legality is about. Slaveholder legality is about controlling slaves, and controlling slaves graphically and violently. And so the response to the rebellion, which is a retributive and violent legal response in the form of death sentences, executions carried out in a relatively primitive way by hanging people from a tree branch. I mean, one imagines, executions as people standing on scaffolds and trapdoors opening and bodies falling through them and necks snapping, and it's supposed to be relatively instantaneous. That is a form of public execution that is atypical of American executions prior to the Civil War, and it's certainly not typical of this set of executions, this set of legal executions undertaken in Southampton County in September and October of 1831. These are people strangled by a rope, a halter around the neck, who are conscious that they are hanging, strangling for several minutes. So what I was trying to do is to look at what you have here, in other words, is not one form of violence met by a retributive legal punishment. You have a form of violence arising from the conditions of slavery, met by another form of violence that also arises from the conditions of slavery. The whole chapter about the rebellion, in other words, is a counterposition of these two forms of violence and the different consciousnesses that inhabit each form. And the other strand is the sort of the political economy strand, which pulls back from the personage of Nat Turner, the event of the rebellion, to a wider focus on Virginia politics between the early 19th century and the 1830s, 1840s for that matter. Because the rebellion occurs after a long period in which white Virginia has been fighting with itself over the future of the polity that is constructed in the colonial era and that favors slaveholder counties in the East and the Piedmont, in the Tidewater and the Piedmont, who are confronted increasingly by the influx of predominantly non-slaveholding yeoman farmers into Western Virginia, into what is now Western Virginia and what was then simply the western part of the state of Virginia. And a political fight between these two interests over who gets to wield power within the state of Virginia, who in the white community, or in these different white communities, gets to wield power. So there is the state convention in 1829, which begins to lay bare a deep conflict between slaveholding and non-slaveholding white communities. That cleavage reappears in a much bolder form after the Turner Rebellion, when there is some movement towards a push for for the abolition of slavery, the gradual abolition of slavery in Virginia. Not, I would say, out of any kind of sort of liberal or humanitarian desire to end an oppressive institution. The idea is, slavery is a corruption of white Virginia. And the idea is to get rid of slavery and to get rid of slaves as well, to get rid of the institution and to expel all of its inhabitants, its Black, its African-American inhabitants, out of, to cleanse the white community. So that then becomes the last part of the book, and this political conflict kind of breaks. It comes to a chaotic end, in which the emancipation debate breaks down completely. And what it's replaced by is a new set of arguments that are couched not in the law and politics of whether or not political institutions can institute plans of gradual emancipation. It's couched in terms of a political economy of slavery that establishes a positive justification for the long-term interest of Virginia in having a peculiarly commodified form of slavery as its economic backbone. And in a book, and this is where I am now kind of returning to what I see as the sort of the cosmological, if you like, implications. The profane faith of political economy is white Virginia's answer to the sacred violence of Nat Turner. And so you have these two, you end up with these two cosmologies kind of confronting each other. A sacred violence on the one hand, a profane faith in political economy on the other. And, the last part of the book really is an attempt to take these three strands, the strand of religion, the strand of the violence of Virginia's legality, slaveholder legality, and the strand of politics and political economy, and to lay them alongside each other and to try, here I'm returning to my interest in Benjamin, to try to see what image emerges. What image do these three strands, when you entwine them, what does it produce? What does it produce as a historical construct?
Absolutely. So we're at 12:45. So if anyone wants to, using the Q&A function in Zoom, ask any questions, I can read them out for you. Right now we don't have any questions, but please go ahead and ask away if you would like. I just want to say quickly on the point of law and violence you're making, Chris. I think that this is really important and powerfully demonstrated in the book. Because there is this tendency, not least I would say in William Styron actually, to kind of really play up the graphic violence of the rebellion, but in the context that you provide, which is the appropriate context, right? That violence needs to be understood. I would say as occurring within an ongoing state of war, right? So sometimes in the history of philosophy, we think the war comes before enslavement, right? Which comes out of some kind of pact. thinking about it as an ongoing state of war, right? In which these two asymmetrical sides, are constantly deploying violence against one another is, I think, a useful way to approach these things. I want to actually pick up more explicitly the kind of Benjamin thread, because he's also in Freedom Bound. He has been with you for some time, and if you could talk a little bit more about why he has spoken to you, and why it seems to me that you get something from him that you feel like you can't get somewhere else. That there's a way in which his writing has been a spur to your thinking over the longer term. And I'm genuinely curious if you could say more about how that has worked for you.
I believe quite strongly that the role I have as a historian is not simply the role of kind of engaging in this or that form of what I would characterize as positivist empirical reconstruction of past moments for its own sake. I think the role of the historian has to be to reflect equally. Actually, I hate the word reflect. I mean, to consider as fully what you're actually doing as you were doing it, what you were trying to achieve from engaging in these forms of investigation. Which means that alongside the history you write, you need to have a philosophy of why you're writing it, or a philosophy that guides the actual process of imagination, of creative engagement. And that's what I get from Benjamin. I get a very explicit engagement in thought about what it means to attempt to write history. It's not something you can kind of necessarily, it's not a methodology as such. It's not a form of application. It is a form of thinking constructively about what it means to place events, to understand events, to place them in forms of juxtaposition. And perhaps, even more so to arrive at some comprehension of why it is this particular then attracts our interest, our responsibility to be interested in the moment that we occupy now. There is there's this I find American history incredibly conservative, incredibly empirical, and incredibly unreflective. And that is probably true, unreflective on the question of what it is attempting to do as it is doing it. It's like kind of meat and potatoes intellectual process. You are simply producing bricks of knowledge without a sense of why. That's never been good enough for me. And it's Benjamin really who helps me wish to push, no matter how inadequately, who helps me at least define a desire to push into territory that lies beyond simple empirical reconstruction. Because that's, you know, that's no good for, that's not really good for anything.
Great. So let me ask you also about Styron. So because in terms of like, I came to this book already pretty sold on the importance of the Thomas Gray pamphlet. You know, you were preaching to the choir, you know, a bit in speaking to the importance of that pamphlet. I read the William Styron Confessions of Nat Turner, I want to say like 2 decades ago. And at that time in my life, I found it kind of gross, and I've never gone back to it. I've been interested in, there's that book, I think, is it called 10 Black Writers Respond? There are various, so there are various kinds of interesting responses that happened at the time. I think maybe remain disinclined a little bit to engage with Styron, but you did convince me that there might be actually something worth thinking about there. In particular, you were interested in Styron's term, a meditation on history. You know, and so I'm just wondering if you could talk about how Styron also fits into this Styron, and also the kind of context and response to Styron fits into this project.
It's a really good question. I don't think, you know, William Styron was a very successful writer. I don't think he was a very good writer. He has too many limitations, too many ticks and flaws, and he's pompous. He's desperately trying to be a writer, so much that he gets in his own way. There are many ways in which you could sort of, I read kind of dutifully quite a lot of his work. I found it unattractive in many ways. I hate Sophie's Choice. I don't like the early work. Some of his essays are good. In comparison with the rest of his, you know, of what he produced, Confessions of Nat Turner is actually, it could well be his best book. But Styron meets, in Gray's pamphlet, Styron meets Nat Turner, and he hates him. He doesn't want to have anything to do with the Turner he meets. So, you know, Gray achieves his objective, you might say, in William Styron. William Styron reads Gray's pamphlet in exactly the way Gray hoped it would be read, the way Gray instructed people in his pamphlet to read it. Because the Turner that Styron met and imagined is this sort of incomprehensible monster, this religious fanatic, this crazy person. And so he created his own Turner, a different Turner, and wrote about that instead. But at the same time, Styron says that his desire is to use the book as a meditation on history. He's never, ever able to articulate what he means by that. He tries and tries and tries, and he fails and fails and fails. I believe that there is one point in his writing where one can understand what he means by that. And it is, what he means by that is, I think, that there is no caesura, no strong distinction or any distinction between that past event, which is off there somewhere, that can be constructed as separate from where one is now. So he talks about the indistinguishable. He talks at one point in his essay, This Quiet Dust, about the indistinguishable moment between then and now. And that's what he's trying to get at in the Confessions of Nat Turner. The indistinguishable moment, the lack of distinction between his situation as a writer in the 1960s and what he is writing about, which takes place 130 years earlier, but has a profound relevance to his situation as a writer in the 1960s. And that I take seriously, and that I think, although I'm very critical of Styron as a writer, and I'm very critical of how he refused to meet the Turner that he encountered, nevertheless, there is something serious there that he could actually be proud of as a writer, as a novelist. So I don't simply want to end up saying, "Oh, William Styron's a crap writer." But that would be unfair, because he was attempting something important.
Okay, so we've reached the end of our hour. So I just want to say again, thanks to the Townsend Center for hosting this event. Thanks, Chris. It was good. It was good talking with you.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for being the interlocutor, and thank you for reading my book as carefully as you've done. I hope others do too. That would be nice.
Yes, and thanks everyone for coming out. Okay.
Take care. Take care.